And we're back for the Thousand Worlds Book Club, and we're talking about the Plague Star. I am joined by Ygritte. Now, Ygritte, you've read A Song of Ice and Fire and all of the Thousand Worlds? No, I don't need to be reading your stories. The songs of the free folk are much better than your southern lies. Okay, well, the Plague Star is a fun little King of the Hill or Game of Thrones tale where 6 players duke it out for essentially godlike status. If you haven't read it, the link is below, so pause, read it, and come back. Sorry there's no audiobook out there for it, but I did read the prologue as a preview. Now, The Plague Star is the first story in the Tuf Voyaging series chronologically, but it was actually published in 1985, 9 years after George R.R. Martin's first Tuf piece, A Beast for Norn. Essentially, our author went back and wrote an origin story. The story also answers a lot of questions raised from In the House of the Worm, namely, who are the Theta people, and how did they control eater worms? Now, before The Plague Star, we have a little prologue that our author wrote when he released the Tuf Voyaging collection. It's a found captain's log of a dying trader who came to the planet Hrobana to trade with the Haroon, a giant-like former Harangan slave race. But the giants aren't slaves, they are free folk like us. Well, I said these Haroon were giant-like, and they're former slaves. And since giant skeletons were found in the caves of the Children of the Forest, I imagine at least some of the giants were former slaves as well. Bat-like dactyloids are also a slave race on this planet, again giant bats being found in the Children's Cave, and we even hear a legend of the Harangan mines, who were their telepathic masters, and now hide beneath the earth on old Haranga, waiting to return. What are you trying to say, that the Children of the Forest are the Harangan mines? Not that that's impossible, but I just think our author is taking the same characters, themes, and relationships and repeating them. We have 2 stories with subterranean telepathic masters of giants and bats. This prologue of yours did use the phrase, fire and blood, and I think grayscale may have made an appearance. I thought you said you didn't read the story. I didn't. We free folk know things. Well, anyway, the captain of this story is not being killed off by the slave races, but instead by the titular Plague Star. The star is described as something that comes every 3 generations and brings disease. Of course, it's not really a star, it's a spaceship sending down genetically engineered diseases. We have seen celestial objects not being celestial objects before. In Men of Greywater Station, a shooting star was really a spaceship as well, and we come across something very similar in Night Flyers. And this all makes me wonder about the comet from Ice and Fire. Hashtag comet is Vulcan. Now, it should be noted that the Haroon legend about the Plague Star is rejected by the protagonist, and we find this a bit in our author's work, especially Ice and Fire. Characters will reject oral history because it's flawed, but in fact these legends contain nuggets of great truth. Right, there's old Nan's stories in Ice and Fire, and old John's stories in Bitterblooms, and the Ground legends in the House of the Worm. And you're saying you didn't read any of these stories? Aye, I am very wise. Now, the Plague Star story proper is about 6 individuals seeking out the Plague Star, which is a spaceship. It's really the Ark, an Ecological Engineering Corps seed ship. The Ecological Engineering Corps were humans' biowar experts, and they're the ones that founded the civilization in the House of the Worm. The Corps could alter themselves genetically and could create almost any organism. They could also control these organisms with technology-aided telepathy. And this once again goes back to our author's much-loved hive-minded collective consciousness theme. The Harangans are hive-minded, the Findi are hive-minded, the Greywater fungus is hive-minded, and apparently sometimes humans are as well. As are the Children of the Forest, the Undying, and the others. And wargs as well. It's hard to say where the animal ends and the master begins. And knowing this, I would guess that the Ecological Engineering Corps used to be able to control the eater worms with technology, but then lost the technology over time. Now, the Ecological Engineering Corps waged biowar against the Harangans, and one of their ships ended up in a long orbit around an old Harangan world. Every 3 generations, the ship unleashes a season of disease. Ah, unusual orbits and unusual seasons. It reminds me of Bitterblooms, a story you claim you haven't read. I don't even know how to read. Now, besides our protagonist Tuf, there are 5 other characters that are seeking the Plague Star. There is Celise Wan, who reminds me of Stannis' wife. She's an academic who discovered the Plague Star. There's Jefri Lion, whose name evokes Joffrey, but his personality is actually quite different. He's a military historian and colleague of Celise. Lion has hired a bodyguard named Rica Dawnstar, and for some reason Wan and Lion have brought in Kaj Nevis and the half-human cyborg Anittas. Nevis seems to know a lot about salvage and their surrounding systems, and Anittas seems to know a lot about ancient technology. However, we don't get much of their backstory, which is a shame considering that Nevis is the primary antagonist, and Anittas' relationship with Nevis is so important to the plot. Now the six set off on Tuf's ship in order to find the Plague Star, but Rica Dawnstar, who is like the Littlefinger character, is upset that she's not getting a big cut. She tries to go to Tuf, but he only bargains for his own cut to be increased. Dawnstar finds this unfair, and so she goes to Nevis and convinces him that a 3-way split is better than a 5 or 6-way split. And this is essentially the plot and theme of the story. What justifies ownership, and what justifies rule? We free folk choose our leaders. Sure, and most modern readers love democracy. However, there are massive flaws to unchecked majority rule. The disaffected minority has no reason to buy into the system. And clearly Dawnstar had a different idea on who should rule. She thought the smartest should rule, which is why she initially tried to form an alliance with Tuf. Of course, Celise thinks a finder's keeper's principle gives her right to the Ark, and Jefri Lion believes he has the strongest moral position. For Nevis and Anittas, though, it's might makes right. This same disagreement happened at the end of a Game of Thrones. Ned believed the kingship was owned by Stannis, but Renly thought he was morally the best person to lead. In the end, the Lannisters used their might. But of course, might makes right doesn't really work, as people go into revenge mode against you. After Nevis gets Anittas infected, Anittas essentially just wants to kill Nevis. He essentially becomes the Doran Martell revenge character. And Dawnstar, the Littlefinger character in the control room, tries to get everyone to kill each other. So who do you think will win the Game of Thrones? Who is Tuf? Well, likely Sansa. Like Tuf, she spends most of her time on the sidelines while everyone else kills each other. But I think the most important question is why our author had Tuf win. Yes, he's smart, but there seems to be something more. Dawnstar was also smart and not that bad of a person, and yet she is still an antagonist. And Lion was smart and very morally good. So what was it about Tuf that made him better than both Dawnstar and Lion? Likewise, why has our author chosen to have Sansa live while other characters like Eddard and Robb have died? Is it simply luck, or is our author making a statement? Haviland Tuf is a good person, but he also has some moral flexibility. Additionally, he's not so naive like Eddard or Lion. I definitely think you're onto something, girl who never read the book, and we'll keep our eye out in future stories on why our author thought a character like Haviland Tuf should be God. What I also think is interesting is how hyper-aware our author is about tropes. In this story, a Tyrannosaurus Rex sneaks up behind Dawnstar and is about to eat her. Tuf tries to warn her, but she doesn't believe him. We've all seen this trope a million times in entertainment. But our author fools us. Dawnstar knew about the Tyrannosaurus and was telepathically controlling it the whole time. Luckily, Jefri Lion had set up a laser cannon earlier in the story, and the cannon blows away the Tyrannosaurus and Dawnstar. Lion had set up a Chekhov's gun that our author is nodding to and making even more obvious by having it be a literal gun. But lots of stories have meta-humor and try to subvert tropes. Sure, but this was the mid-'80s. Our author was ahead of his time. He even wrote a book in 1983 called The Armageddon Rag about how played out The Lord of the Rings was. And yet 3 decades later, we're still getting the same hidden prince, chosen one, good versus evil fantasy tales. Which is why he's able to shock us. He's very aware of what the audience is expecting and tries to do something else. Or at least be very different about it. Oh, you have insufficient knowledge, Preston Jacobs. Jon Snow is the chosen one, and he will be defeating the others. You mean Jon Snow? It's pronounced Jon Snow. I should know. I had sex with him. Well, I'll say this about Jon Snow being the chosen one and defeating evil. Our author has never written a story that has ended that way. It is a trope that our author seems to want to avoid. Weirdo freak protagonists like Tuf can succeed, but not a classic hero like Jon Snow. At least not in a badass sword fight triumph over evil sort of way. But even Tuf the Weirdo doesn't have a traditional ending ultimately. But we have several stories before we're going to get to that. Anyway, I'd like to thank Ygritte for joining me. But wait, I thought we were sharing stories. You told me about the Plague Star. Now I get to tell you about Bale the Bard. Sorry, we're out of time. Okay, but I think I'm gonna shoot you with an arrow. Other fucking kneeler. And so next time we'll be continuing our adventures with Tuf with Loaves and Fishes. The link to the story is above. See you then.